First of all, to all of the Vietnam veterans in the group, thanks for your service and welcome home. I have an unusual perspective on Vietnam, having spent years in the early days of the war, traveling around the country and debating professors and leaders of SDS and other organizations. I was involved in over 100 debates and similar programs. Every time I heard the same litany of arguments, all of which were false, save for the argument that war is a horrible thing and good people get killed in war. So nobody likes war. But if you don't stand up to aggression, we learned at Munich that the cost can be far greater once you empower the aggressors. There was a big debate in the 1960s over whether we were protecting South Vietnam from foreign aggression or interfering in a civil war and propping up a dictator and so forth. The good news is that's no longer debatable. After Hanoi published its official history of the war, translated into English by a member of the Vietnam Veterans for Factual History, there cannot be any question. They documented in tremendous detail that on May 19th, 1959, Ho Chi Minh's birthday, Hanoi made a decision to open the Ho Chi Minh Trail and start pouring troops, supplies, and equipment and weapons down through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam, down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was as much aggression as any other war we have ever fought, even though it was covert aggression. It was not until 5 years later, on August 7th, 1964, that Congress enacted the equivalent to a declaration of war, what we today call an authorization for the use of military force, empowering the president to use armed force as he deemed necessary to protect the protocol states of the 1955 SEATO Treaty. Those states were the state of Vietnam, which we knew as South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. That's right, Congress authorized the use of force in Cambodia at the time it did Vietnam, despite the fact that critics complained when we sent troops into Cambodia, which helped us win the war. Some people tried to argue, wait a minute, Vietnam was only temporarily divided at the Geneva Conference, and so it was perfectly permissible for one zone to use force to reunite the country. That doesn't do very well when we recall the Korean War. On June 25th, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United Nations Security Council met, denounced it as an international aggression, and empowered the United States to lead an international force under the UN flag to protect South Korea. You cannot make a credible legal case that the Vietnam War was either unconstitutional or illegal. If you have doubts about that, our center hosted a conference on April 29th, 2000, on 25th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. And we decided we would repeat the old Vietnam debates. And so we contacted the very best international law and constitutional law scholars who had opposed the war back in the 60s and said, hey, let's get together and re-argue those issues, but in light of the evidence we now have, what Hanoi has provided us. We went more than 6 deep in each area before anybody would touch it. They can't make the case. We did finally find 2 very lightweight people to debate it, and this book has the transcript of those debates. I debated the constitutional law issues. My opponent made an opening statement, and when his time for rebuttal came, he basically said, that's all I've got. It's just, the idea that it was an illegal war is absolutely wrong. Now, another major point, we did not lose the Vietnam War on the battlefields of Vietnam. Indeed, we did not lose a single major battle during the war. This is less a commentary of the lack of courage and ability of our opponents than it was in the fact that we had superior air power, and any time they decided to stay and fight, we clobbered them and we destroyed them. But by 1968, the National Liberation Front / Viet Cong, which had been a creature of Hanoi from the beginning, virtually ceased to exist. They had been destroyed by the Tet Offensive and the May 1968 offensive. An old late friend of mine, Harry Summers, wrote a book called On Strategy, and in the beginning he opens with this exchange. "You know you never defeated us on the battlefield," the American colonel said, and that colonel was Harry Summers, by the way. The North Vietnamese colonel responded, "That may be so, but it's also irrelevant." And both men were right. I worked in the North Vietnam Viet Cong Affairs Division of the embassy during my 2 military tours. They created a job called Assistant Special Projects Officer for me. And Douglas Pike worked in that same office 3 times. We alternated between the 2 of us. And Doug wrote, "I believe future historians will say not only could the war have been won, but that we had it won." Bill Colby, an old and dear friend, well, he was the CIA station chief in Saigon in the late 1950s, came back and he was a number 3 civilian in Vietnam throughout much of the war, went on to be the director of Central Intelligence, the head of the CIA. He wrote a wonderful book called Lost Victory, and he used to come down every year to speak to my Vietnam War seminar at UVA Law School. And he noted that the big test was the Spring '72 offensive, also known as the Easter Offensive, although not by the North Vietnamese. They didn't care much about Easter. But Bill Colby says on the ground in South Vietnam, the war had been won. And I think he is exactly right. That's a photo of Bill and my colleague John Norton Moore, who was the leading international law scholar supporting the war. Another old friend of mine, Robert Elegant, wrote a fascinating article called How to Lose a War. You can find it if you Google that title. It's been copied and put on the internet. And he says South Vietnam and American forces actually won the limited military struggle. John Lewis Gaddis is a professor of history at Yale. He wrote a 2-part series for Foreign Affairs. And he said historians now acknowledge American counterinsurgency operations in Vietnam were succeeding during the final years of the war. Sadly, we lost the support of the American people, and that was not enough. John Gaddis is often referred to as the dean of American diplomatic historians. After the war ended, Hanoi admitted it had lost more than 1 million troops in the war, nearly 4 times the total loss of the South Vietnamese, American, and Allied forces combined. Now, why was it important to go to war to protect South Vietnam from communist aggression? After World War II, General Eisenhower was concerned that the American people would not tolerate spending large sums of money on military. And he decided to cut back our ground forces, where we were already overwhelmingly overpowered by the Soviet Empire. They had several times more tanks than we had, more artillery pieces, more divisions. But Ike said after Korea, we don't want to match China man for man in a land war in China. What we want to do is deter war. And we're going to do that by responding to future aggression at a time and manner of our own choice. And Mr. Khrushchev, in case you're not listening, look around Moscow and see what you want to see glowing for the half-life of uranium-235. Don't mess with us. And it worked with Khrushchev. He backed down. He said, now is not the time for armed struggle. But that's where our friend Mao Zedong comes in. And also the other thing that came in is Eisenhower's strategy worked great when we had an overwhelming preponderance of nuclear power, but the communists, they had a few nuclear weapons, but nothing that could match us. But as Moscow's arsenal increased, then the issue became, is America really going to trade New York and Chicago and Atlanta to save Saigon? And that was very dubious. But Mao came along and said, yes, in appearance, the imperialists are very fierce. But we are going to use people's warfare, what Moscow called wars of national liberation. We are going to send in advisors and money and weapons to train guerrillas who will then fight among the people. They would live among the people, work among the people, and when appropriate, take up arms and fight. So if you decide to use nuclear weapons, for every guerrilla you kill, you're going to kill hundreds of totally innocent people. The Americans are not that foolish, and their allies are not that foolish. They would never tolerate that. And thus, Mao said, nuclear weapons are irrelevant. And Vietnam became a test case of this. Indeed, Lin Pao, the vice chair of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, gave a very important speech that was published in a document called Long Live the Victory of People's Wars, in which he said the future of the world revolution will be determined on the battlefields of Vietnam. He said, once the Vietnamese have proven that American counterinsurgency techniques will not work, then we will have many Vietnams all over the third world. Che Guevara, Fidel Castro's top military advisor, said the future of the struggle, for the revolutionary struggle in the Americas will be decided on the battlefields of Vietnam. Moscow and Beijing had a big feud going on at this point. And one of the issues was whether it was appropriate to move to armed struggle. Khrushchev said no, Mao said yes. Had we walked away from Vietnam in 1964 or 1965, we would have proven that Mao was right, that we did not have an answer to these kinds of threats, and we might actually have seen the reunification of the communist empire, with Moscow saying, okay, we don't have to worry about American intervention. Throughout the third world, there were dissident groups who wanted power. If they saw that by siding with the communists they could get power, they would think, okay, we'll get their money and their guns and their training, and then when we get power, we'll throw them out. Never happened that way, because the communists always made sure they got the key ministries, like the defense ministry and the treasury. The interior, of course, in this country, the interior department takes care of our national parks, and most of the world, it's the internal police. And there's not a single case where a group accepted the aid of a communist, and the communists did not come out on top after victory. Now, another point I'm not going to dwell on, but very important, we fought most of the Vietnam War with one hand tied behind our backs. And that totally undermined deterrence. It encouraged Hanoi. It demoralized the hell out of our troops, and it turned many Americans against the war. In 1968, in the New Hampshire primary, McCarthy almost got a majority of the votes. It shocked everyone. It led LBJ to decide not to run for re-election. And it later turned out that a majority of the people who voted for McCarthy went on to vote for George Wallace and Curtis LeMay. They were super hawks casting protest votes over our no-win policies in Indochina. Another old friend of mine, Bob Elligan, and Bob and I were on a panel at the Texas Tech Vietnam Center that Steve Sherman put together, I think 2 years ago, talking about the media in Vietnam. And Bob wrote an excellent article called How to Lose a War. If you Google that title and quotes, you'll find it's been put on the internet by at least 2 groups. And it is a damnation of the role of the media at undermining public support for the war. And candidly, I shared that view. There were some outstanding journalists in Vietnam, but there also were an awful lot of hacks that had no idea what was going on. And there were a number of people who went there because they thought the war was a horrible thing. We can discuss this more during Q&A. Now, it's important to understand Hanoi's strategy. They understood they could not defeat the United States military in a war, and they never intended to. They had a multifaceted struggle. See, Americans tend to think that if you've got a military problem, you go to the Pentagon, an economic problem, maybe you go to Treasury, Commerce. The communists understood that struggle is like an orchestra. You've got your percussion and your strings and your wind and your horns and so forth. You play them all together. And they understood that in addition to the military struggle, there is also the political struggle, which was critical in Vietnam. When they went to war against France in 1947, the Viet Minh had a very effective propaganda campaign inside France, telling the French people to oppose the war, to block troop trains and so forth. And they defeated the French. They won the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in the sense that they overran it, but they suffered several times more fatalities than the French did, even counting the French troops who died on the forced march back to Hanoi. To say that Dien Bien Phu was in any meaningful sense a military victory for the Viet Minh is simply not true. But it was an incredible political defeat. It brought down the Linnell government in Paris. The Chinese the whole game here was logistics. Everybody knew, Dien Bien Phu was surrounded by mountains, but it was all triple canopy jungle and so forth. There's no way you could get artillery in there. And thus, small arms fire was not going to have an effect, on the base. You might occasionally pick someone off, but you're shooting at, a mile away or so. But Giap organized tens of thousands of laborers. They built roads. They took apart artillery pieces and strapped them onto bicycles and so forth. And it was a brilliant logistics move. They put the artillery the Chinese had given them after China fell to Mao, and they put it on a direct fire mode, firing straight down the mountain into the airfield. Dien Bien Phu was totally dependent upon aviation for resupply. Once you put a few big craters in that landing, in that airfield, nobody's going to land there more than once, let's put it that way. And so the Viet Minh dug tunnels to right outside the French perimeter. And when the French dropped, parachuted in supplies, as often as not, it missed the target and a hand went up and dragged it down and the Viet Minh had dinner for 2 weeks. The game was over. Les jours sont faits, as the French say. And then the Chinese military advisors say, hold it, Giap, hold it. Wait, we will tell you when to take the kill. And French and European newspapers, day after day, front page stories, Dien Bien Phu still holds on. And the day before the Geneva conference, which had been discussing Korea, took up Indochina, they overran Dien Bien Phu. Banner headline, Dien Bien Phu falls. The Linnell government fails. Pierre Mendès France, a socialist, worked with the communists and set up a coalition after promising to bring peace in Indochina within 30 days or he would resign his position. The reason they beat the French was because of political warfare. Now, I talk about this in my 1975 book, Vietnamese Communism. If you can find a copy of that, you're luckier than I am. There are not a lot of copies out there, but it has a lot of information on this whole history. They did the same thing to us. They used propaganda. Moscow, Beijing, Havana all helped in. And I heard these same arguments at virtually every debate and program. The U.S. first got involved to restore French colonial rule after World War II. Absolutely not true. We actually prohibited American merchant ships from carrying troops or supplies from France to Vietnam. We favored liberation, or the freedom, the end of colonial rule. They said that we violated the Geneva Accords. Not true at all. We didn't sign anything at Geneva, nor did South Vietnam, on the issue of the so-called reunification elections in 1956. Our position, spelled out very clearly, was that we would only support elections if they were supervised by the United Nations to ensure that they were conducted fairly. You have to remember that North Vietnam got a majority of the population. Molotov, the head of the Soviet delegation and co-chair of the Geneva Conference, said that would be interfering in the internal affairs of the Vietnamese people to have supervision. Ho actually had some bogus elections in the North where there were soldiers at the voting booths to help people mark their ballots. Indeed, China was funding guerrillas and training them and supplying them throughout Southeast Asia and as far away as Mozambique and Africa. By holding on for a decade, we bought time for Thailand and Indonesia to become stronger and for the PRC to turn inward during the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, during which Lin Pao crashed in a helicopter, they tell us, and by the time that ended, they were no longer exporting revolution. Had we abandoned Indochina in '64, my guess is we would have soon had the option of using nuclear weapons, the only way we could possibly have dealt with several Vietnams, they're just too expensive, or losing the Cold War one country at a time. If you have any doubts about the evil nature of communism, the Black Book of Communism was written by some very left-wing European intellectuals, many of whom had been active communists, who had realized what an evil system it was, and their conclusion was that during the 20th century, 80 to 100 million people died as a direct result of communism. We have repeatedly extended an invitation to anyone on the left who wants to debate the morality, the legality, the policy wisdom of our war in Indochina. Nobody has accepted, not a single one. The offer remains open. For those of you who served in Vietnam, thank you for your service. Welcome home. And let me stop there.